Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the 2021 Aday Distinguished Lecture. As Purdue University's Executive Vice President for Research and Partnership, I am honored to welcome you to this event. This is an important opportunity to learn about the exceptional work of one of your colleagues. The Aday Award is Purdue's most prestigious research award in the humanities and social sciences. I am pleased to have in the studio with me this year's awardee, Ernst Kossek, the Basil S. Turner Distinguished Professor of Management in the Krannert School of Management. I also have with me Kartik Kannan, the Associate Dean for Research and Partnerships, the Thomas Howat Chaired Professor in Management in the Krannert School of Management, and the director of the Kronicki Center for Business Analytics and Machine Learning. Professor Kannan nominated Professor Kossek for this award and will introduce her. He will also moderate the Q&A following the lecture. During the event, we will accept questions through the Q&A module and address as many as possible immediately following the lecture. In addition to live streaming the event, a recording will be posted on the EVPRP website. Before I turn things over to Professor Kannan, I would like to offer a brief background on the award. Purdue alumna Luann Aday established this award to honor a recent achievement of major scientific impact by a Purdue faculty member in the humanities or social sciences. Aday received an honorary doctorate from Purdue in 2004 and is currently the Lorne D. Bain Distinguished Professor Emerita in Public Health and Medicine at the University of Texas School of Public Health in Houston. The award endowed by Aday in 2017 recognizes the consistently impactful innovations and discovery produced by Purdue's faculty. Aday Award winners are nominated by their peers, selected by a committee of distinguished faculty, and are approved by the Executive Vice President for Research and Partnerships and the President of the University. I will now turn things over to Professor Kannan.
Good afternoon. I'm pleased to introduce my colleague, Kossek, a distinguished professor and the Basil S. Turner Professor at the Krannert School of Management, and this year's recipient of the Aday Award. Ellen is a preeminent scholar in the field of work and family life balance. She has published over 100 articles, 10 books, and 30 book chapters. One of her recommenders notes that her research does not stop with her scholarship. She's translated management research to practical strategies for large companies and policymakers. She's often invited to speak to managers and government leaders around the globe. She's had a broad impact in the field and has truly changed how we think about work-life balance management. Would you please join me in welcoming Kossek onto the stage?
Thank you, Karthik, and thank you, Teresa, as well. It is my great honor to be here, and I'd like to talk today about something that we all have been thinking about during the pandemic, but the research on this began long before COVID-19. COVID-19, though, brought out the inequalities that exist in our society in work-life balance and also made them more visible. And there's an opportunity now for organizations and managers to rethink how we manage people and work for health and well-being improvement in our society. So in August alone, we had over 2.9% of the entire US workforce quit, of those who were employed. That is a huge number, nearly 5 million workers. And if you look at this breakdown, 55% of the workers still are going to look for a new job next year, and many of the people who quit were women since COVID-19 began. In fact, the World Economic Forum thinks that the women quitting, either through job loss, often middle-aged and older women lost their jobs, as well as older men, and also the need for caregiving and elder care as schools shut down and daycare centers shut down and nursing homes were a challenge to manage elder care. Many women stayed out of the workforce to cover caregiving as well. And also different sectors lost their jobs, such as the service sector and healthcare. We'll talk more about that later, but women are overrepresented in those sectors. Believe it or not, the U.S. only rates 28th in the entire world for work-life balance in terms of OECD rankings. And as our new workforce is coming up, we're missing an opportunity to really capture our workforce to want to work longer and keep the workers that are there now wanting to work longer as well. In fact, half of Generation Z and millennials said they would give up 10% of their salary to work virtually. And health issues are growing. Over 625 million U.S. citizens suffer from depression and anxiety, but would be employed if we could redesign work. So all of you right now may be wondering what's happening as you're planning Christmas packages or whatever you celebrate. And FedEx now is rerouting 600,000 packages a day due to a skilled worker shortage. Their stock price is down. And in fact, this is a long-term problem that workers now are not as enticed by the workplace. There's going to be a global shortfall of skilled workers of more than 85 million by 2030. In addition, we've seen our containers and truck drivers are not staffed adequately, and everything that you've been waiting for is maybe still stuck offshore if you've noticed empty supplies at the grocery store. So COVID-19 happened, and there were different occupational impacts of this. First off, we had forced home working, and women still were primary caregivers. I did a study for the National Academy of Science as a report on STEM women and how COVID-19 affected them. I focused on women academics at over 200 universities, and even in dual career couples, women were caring for children and doing 90% of the domestic labor in terms of doing more of it. So it still was not equal, even among highly skilled men and women. And then the frontline workers didn't have a choice. They couldn't really access work-life balance. They had horrible job stress. They had to figure out childcare, elder care, how to be safe, commuting to work. And basically, we didn't do very much for these workers, and many of them could not get off work when they needed to, even if they got sick, which could further spread COVID. So it's very important that we think differently about work and learn from this pandemic. So work-life inequality, I've written a number of articles on this, and I believe it's a growing form of job inequality. It's a public health issue, it's an economic issue, and it is one that is not going to go away without taking action. The definition of work-life inequality is unequal ability to control work schedules, boundaries, access flexibility, and you have chronic exposure to work-life stress, overwork, and long hours. Women and minorities are overrepresented in essential occupations. For example, 75% of hospital workers are women, and if you look at elder care and care for children, most of those caregivers are women, and many are women of color and immigrants as well. Then if you look at food manufacturing, 50% of food manufacturing workers and 40% of grocery workers are Black, Asian, or Hispanic. And then if you also look at even those that stay in the labor force, even if they're juggling childcare and elder care, if you look at mothers who are women versus non-mothers who are women, 80% less pay will be accumulated over a career if you are a working mother compared to other women. And then compared to men in similar jobs, there's a 69 cents compared to dollar pay differential between men and women in similar jobs, because women are taking more time out of the labor force when they have a child or care for elders. Also, they are restructuring work more to manage home life. And this will change, of course, as more men become involved in caregiving. I think that the pandemic is like the Depression and other times when people came back, say, from World War II, a fundamental shift in our society. And we are really going to rethink the employment contract. And many workers today are wondering, what is the role of work in my life? I'm working very hard. My parents, who were the boomers, are working so hard. Many of them lost their jobs. What do they have to show for it? Employers are not offering job security very much, and even not offering control over work-life schedules. and people are exhausted from the pandemic. And assuming that people are paid well enough, I don't want to underemphasize the importance that we have many low-income workers that can't get enough hours to work and aren't being paid well. You can now see those $20 an hour signs for fast food workers at McDonald's and Burger King in some parts of the country. But assuming people have adequate pay to cover housing and other costs of their living, people value well-being and work life more than ever before. And during the pandemic, we learned that everybody had to do their jobs a little differently. We had to cover each other's job a little bit more. We had to communicate differently. Organizations and workers experimented and proved that work could get done differently. And yet, employers really didn't change all that much. They just said, oh, you could work at home more, and that's about it. And yet, employees now are saying, we want more. So that's a picture of the strike at John Deere. There's also a strike going on at Kellogg's. And I think that there will be more labor strife if we don't change how we structure work. So what do workers want? Well, they want supportive leaders on and off the job. And some of that is flexibility. Flexibility is the new currency for employment. And what I'm worried about is that employers could implement bad flexibility, which is flexibility that is still mostly employer determined. And I want you to think today about the idea of true flexibility. Flexibility that's more balanced for win-win, that meets employer needs to get the work done and also helps employees be able to control when and where and how they work. And even frontline workers should be able to have access to flexibility. They can trade shifts. We can have staffing levels that allow for someone to rotate between departments. We can have a way for somebody to have coverage if they need to take time off. For example, if they did get COVID, we have to really rethink our human resource strategies. So we want meaningful work, we want to be able to learn and have job clarity, but most important, forget those yoga classes that you're spending money on or all those other healthy snacks. Those are important, but they're Band-Aids. We need to have leaders manage differently. Leaders create the culture. The first line supervisor in our scientific studies was the most important determinant of well-being in our interventions. And that provides work-life fit so people can feel that they can stay employed and have a life outside work and that their family isn't sacrificing. A recent survey by Manpower, one of the largest placement firms in the US, found flexibility is a top 3 job factor. And if you search online through jobs that are posted online, just this year alone, on something called Snagalog, it's up from 8% to 11% of all job postings. I expect that trend to continue. Yet the U.S. labor policy for work and family is very much patchwork. It's a market minimalist approach. Our policy is in the front hands of employers, and some employers, if they're benevolent and you're lucky enough to work for an employer that cares about flexibility and work-life issues, you're fortunate. Or if you have a supervisor who supports you. But many workers don't have that. And so work-life inequality, as I stated, existed long before COVID. But COVID exacerbated it and exposed it. And I recently wrote an article in Business Policy Journal that talked about 3 policy innovations. Many employees lack access to and the ability to use paid sick leave and family leave. Exception is the federal government recently passed 12 weeks of paid leave. Often for labor innovation, you see changes in federal government policy and then the private sector mirrors it. Yet I'm not sure if that's going to happen. Regardless of your political persuasion, it may or may not happen this year, but hopefully it will in the future. The U.S. is one of only 6 countries in the world and the only major wealthy industrialized country that lacks any form of mandated paid sick and family leave. Employers also didn't plan and had emergency backup staffing at hospitals or say in our grocery stores. And in many countries such as the UK and Australia and others around the globe, employees have the right to request a flexible and reasonable schedule and work hours. We don't have any of that in the United States. So at UCLA, there is a World Policy Center, and I'm just going to quickly show a few maps. But basically, this is showing that we are the only country of the major ones, and one of only 6, that lacks paid leave for mothers of infants. 186 countries around the world have paid leave, and the average time off is 26 weeks. If the current legislation goes through, it might be 4 weeks if we're lucky, but I'm not even sure if it will pass. Then if you look at paternity leave, we're not really even talking about that very much. 83 countries around the globe have paternity leave, and studies show that when men are more involved in caregiving, that affects the equality of women. So adding gender equality for women and increasing it has as much to do about men and their roles in caregiving as it does about women. Then paid leave if you're sick, and many workers got sick. I believe 5 million Americans have died since the pandemic, and 174 countries offer paid sick leave for personal illness. Now, how you fund these varies, but the thing is we don't have anything that mandates it. And I believe that every person probably can tell you a work-life story. So I became interested in work and family years ago when I was a doctoral student. We had our first child. I'd been married 3 years. I was only one class short of finishing all my coursework. And at that time, there wasn't paid leave for doctoral students or faculty even, let alone. So I had a choice. Do I stay in my doctoral program or do I take a year off and reapply again? This same issue is happening across all universities and work organizations. If we want to increase the STEM workforce, for example, we need to think more flexibly about this and do all the incentives we can to keep people in the workforce. Work-life stress then is increasing, and I really think that we're really rethinking about the role of work in our lives. Work-life conflict is the result of different difficulties in integrating work and non-work aspects of life. It's consistently named as one of the most significant stressors affecting today's workforce. It affects occupations in different ways. So how you would support a teleworker might mean that they could shut off their cell phone on the weekends, and how you might support somebody who's working in a hospital might be to let them have a shift, their 3 shifts, and not be called back in to do extra shifts. And it should be viewed as an occupational hazard. And every job in America should have some access to work-life flexibility. But flexibility alone won't solve things if we don't have a good work-life culture that supports different ways of working and really rethinks how we manage work processes to support the business in different ways. So think about a university calendar. Could we adjust flexibility over the different rhythms of academic life? Or the same with those now gearing up for Thanksgiving, rush and Christmas and holidays as well. Yet we really aren't very adaptive. So high job stress and poor work schedules, that is an occupational health hazard, and it's when the physical and emotional responses that occur that workers need on the job aren't provided in the resources of the job. So it's the interaction of the worker and the environment, and the outcomes are tremendous. If you have high work-life conflict, and I was involved in one of the first major studies in the US on work-life conflict that was a national work-family health network. It involved 6 universities and other centers like Kaiser Permanente, and it was a $30 million grant. And a lot of the early research on work and family was advocacy-based, and we needed longitudinal research and experiments to show that there was a health impact. We all knew it, but we just needed the evidence. So workers with higher work-life stress have higher family conflict, marital stress, decreased satisfaction in life and on the job, higher work-life conflict, crossover, whereas when they bring home the negative impacts onto their family, lower job commitment, engagement, higher turnover, higher absenteeism, and a lot of medical issues. Cardiovascular disease is linked to whether you have a flexible boss, higher substance abuse, and more accidents occur when people are stressed, and even musculoskeletal problems. So job insecurity as well is something that's very stressful. We don't offer that anymore. The least we can do is give people control over some of their flexibility. High job demands lead to illness, and when people are in inflexible jobs, they're more likely to get sick and feel stressed. And long work hours actually increases a 20% chance of mortality. So stress from the workplace, we think about it as an individual issue in the US, but work-life conflict doesn't just impact worker health. It's not confined to the worker, worker. When people go home, they may have what's called spillover, so they're too tired to engage with children when they're home. One of the people on our grant who was at Penn State found that on days that mother had a very stressful day at work, she spent a couple of hours less with her children. They just said, go watch TV. It's not they're being a bad parent, but people are just tired, and men do the same thing. Crossovers when you bring these effects, and maybe you are less patient with your family, and yet we could make work more enriching. There's a new form of research that's been around for a while. When you have a good day at work, that's called work-life enrichment, and you bring that home. And the same, when you have a positive non-work life, you bring that to work. And employers in the U.S. don't really see this as part of how we structure work, but the Work Family Health Network, we did provide scientific evidence about how changes in the work environment can improve the health of workers and their families while benefiting organizations. I worked in this network for over 8 years, and I was working with Dr. Leslie Hammer at Portland State University, now at Oregon Health Sciences, and we came up with an intervention in the Midwest. Got us into a large retail chain, and in half of these stores, we went into 12 stores, and in half of them, we trained the leaders with online training. So think basic jobs like the deli manager on up to a store manager, how to be more family supportive. A lot of leaders don't think of this as part of their job, but we identified 4 behaviors. And in this 1-hour training, here are the behaviors. They learned to be more emotionally supportive for family. So we saw that workers and managers weren't even saying hello in the morning. So you just have to say hello to your workers. How are you doing? How are things going? Very respectfully. If workers don't want to share, that's fine. But how is someone going to tell you that there's a problem if you're not even interacting well? Instrumental support is when leaders help workers solve scheduling conflicts and give some flexibility for schedule needs and encourages cross-training. So emotional support, instrumental support. Work-family role modeling is the 3rd behavior. If you work for a workaholic, you're unlikely to have work-life well-being yourself. And then the 4th behavior is something we called work-family creative management. And we use the word family broadly. We mean work, non-work. Everyone has a family. Single people have friends that feel like family to them. And managers need to think about win-win solutions, such as cross-training, sharing workers across departments, and thinking how to leverage company policies. And what we found in these studies, and now there have been about 50 or 60 of them around the globe, 1/3 of them are in the U.S., 2/3 outside, so there's still more interest in work-life outside of the U.S., but higher job satisfaction in these randomized control trials. So that's what's really important. We train the leaders, but we get these results in employees after the training. So it's kind of like training parents and finding results in children. The other thing we did with this training intervention is we had leaders set goals for 2 weeks after the training, so they could just track their behaviors using an app, and that helped them think about the training on the job. We also have lower turnover intentions. If your leader's trained, it doesn't even matter if it's your direct manager. There's also higher reports of physical health. People report less physical pain. Improved sleep, which is linked to health in many ways. Increased parental time with children. Children sleep longer. Reduced cigarette smoking. And I went into nursing homes for the second study that we did over the 8 years. And there we found that the triple care workers, those with elder care, it might have also been sandwiched with child and elder care. If they were in a work site where there was training for the leaders, they reported improved psychological health using a measure of psychological distress that is an indicator of clinical distress. Also, we had many feeling of improved schedule control. People followed safety rules more, and more organizational citizenship behaviors. You may ask, what is that? That's basically saying, I'll help you out if you need help. Because if somebody's overworked, they're going to say, I don't have time to help you. Now, more recently, I published a Harvard Business Review article called The Future of Flexibility with a couple of colleagues that were former doctoral students. And my fear now is, as we move into flexibility, that we don't make it a flavor of the month endeavor or oversimplify. How do we make flexibility core to an organization's strategies? And companies are a lot better at creating flexible work arrangements than implementing them. And leaders assume that if flexibility is available, workers automatically have work-life balance. Yet we've all seen cases where we might not have been able to get off work or get the flexibility we need. So what we need to do is what I call true flexibility. We need to think about how to be flexible in a way to achieve mutual gain for workers and leaders, to meet business goals and performance and work-life needs. And this requires giving workers some say in how flexibility is implemented, how work is structured, and discuss on teams. Many of organizations implement it as a one-off. We started out as an accommodation approach to flexibility. So you might ask your boss, can I have off on Tuesday or work at home? And they'd say, oh, sure. But then somebody else may have wanted time off, but they just didn't ask. So the accommodation ad hoc approach wasn't so great. And then during the pandemic, we had boundaryless working. You could have all the flexibility you wanted if you were a teleworker, if you answered emails 24/7. That's not sustainable. So we need a new way. We need to look at it as a way to compete in the marketplace. And yet, historically, leaders haven't seen work-life support and flexibility as part of their core supervisor role. I also want to say that in one study I did, you need to think about yourself as well and the people you manage. And over the life course, people have different flexibility needs. So integrators are like that circle at the top. They have communications going back and forth all day long between work and non-work, perhaps on their cell phones. And they might even work during vacation. Separators work in chunks, so perhaps even if they're at home, they have a door to their office, and then when they leave their office, they attend to personal needs, or they might make their personal calls only during lunch hour. Work firsters are always having work interrupt non-work, so you see communications and workload crossing over, but then family isn't dealt with very well, and that part of their life is less developed, and they don't have time for personal life. And over long term, work firsters and integrators with low boundary control are most likely to want to quit. Family firsters in personal life, and I think this is where employers are concerned, are always having personal life interrupting work. So you have communications always going over into the non-work role, but not so much work being dealt with if there's a critical deadline. So we need to help people learn how to manage in this new boundaryless world. And then cyclers are those in industries with high peaks and valleys. So think of the startup of the academic year, finals week, the holiday crush. And we need to have time for people to recover as they go through high periods of integration and separation. There are also many types of flexibility, and I don't think we think broadly enough to give workers a menu of flexibility in time and schedule. And we need to link this to the work processes, the business strategy, location, our telework, how can that save money? The amount of work, job shares, and people who have reduced load actually can work much more intensely than somebody that's slogging along over a 60-hour work week. The right to disconnect and not answer over a weekend and not be stigmatized if you don't work on the weekend. The ability to take breaks, the ability to have comp time. And as somebody, a long-term on-site, mixed, or mobile or off-site worker, the mode of work. It's a whole new world. So as I move forward, I hope that there are a couple things that you'll remember, and then I'll just close with just talking briefly about a few studies. One is the manager matters the most. Remember those 4 behaviors we talked about: emotional support, instrumental support, role modeling, and creative work-life management. That matters. Secondly, people differ in how they need to structure and engage with work and non-work. Some people must integrate, and some people like to keep work separate. We need to respect that as a style and still get the work done within our work processes, but allow some control over what I call boundary management styles. Then flexibility. I encourage you to really not just hire a consultant to give you a computer program to figure out how to do work schedules, but really think through how flexibility will fit with your business processes and include employees in the implementation process and fine-tune it. And some of these other studies I just did, the Academy of Science study, basically what we found there for the women that stayed in the workforce, that with the disrupted boundaries from the centers closing and having to telework and have experiments disrupted, many women were unhappy with what universities were providing, in that they really wanted some workload reduction and increased childcare support. And that wasn't something that universities first did. They basically said, here's flexibility, you figure it out. We need to move away from this laissez-faire approach to managing flexibility and basically take a more active employer role. Then a current study I'm working on is increasing leader support for use of family and sick leave specifically, because many policies go underutilized. So the 4 behaviors I talked about are good for access. Now for use, we need leaders to learn how to implement time off, and also ensure that people aren't stigmatized for using it, and that they're able to come back and be healthy, productive workers. So it's counterintuitive in many organizations to think about, if I give somebody time off, how does that help me? But we really need to rethink differently about flexibility over the career of the worker. The worker shortage is not going to go away. I also have looked at cell phone use on the floor. We've all seen, as we're going through Homeland Security in an airport, maybe somebody using their cell phone, or in a store. We can use them often if we're a knowledge worker on our laptop, answer a text or email, but many workers might have to shut their cell phone in a locker over the breaks. And I wanted to look at if somebody had an emergency or needed to talk to a doctor or a child home from school, if we could change the cell phone policy, would that improve well-being? So I have a randomized control trial with 69 stores, and we will be publishing those results soon, funded by the Russell Sage Foundation. And lastly, I've done involved in a major study from NSF with a number of colleagues on how we can improve work-life boundaries for faculty and well-being as well. So we do need to have policy innovation. We need to invest in infrastructure, and yes, that does include child and elder care. Many centers have closed during the pandemic. We need more geographic flexibility to think about dual careers and talent retention. And we need to change culture and norms to have more flexible career paths, and think about what's called an ideal worker, that there's not just one way to work, but ways to have a diversity of work styles as part of a diversity inclusion strategy to prevent overwork, work-life conflict, and bad teleworking. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ellen. This was a great talk. We have a few questions here, and I'll go describe those questions as we speak. We have a question which is talking about the job leaving behavior, and there is plenty of them right now these days we are noticing. The question asks, are we seeing similar trends in job leaving behaviors around the globe, and are you aware of any research relating to this issue, and is there a national cultural dimension to it as well?
So I have seen reports that it is a global she session, or women out of the workforce. The Davos report did show that as well. I think the US has perhaps had higher quit rates because of the way that we're structured, but I do think it is a global phenomenon as well.
So, here is another question that's on a different dimension that's being asked, right? And this connects back to your comment about flexibility. You mentioned about flexibility and the importance of worker flexibility in terms of their working style and things like that. Is the right to ask for flexibility, does that imply employers have to grant it? It's not necessarily the case in many other countries. Is this right more symbolic than having a real impact?
So I've studied a little bit the right to request laws in the UK, and as I said, Australia. I'm actually going to be going on a Fulbright to the United Kingdom to work on some flexibility with university there for faculty even. And I think what the laws there said when it was first passed in the UK, it was primarily for people with children, and it wasn't strongly implemented, but at least put a line in the sand as sort of a minimum standard to aspire to. And over time, the UK opened it up to all workers. It didn't matter. Anybody can ask now. I think at first, after children, went to elder care and then to anyone. And so it's sort of like accommodation for disability here in the US. The employer has to show that it would be a great cost or inconvenience to accommodate the need for flexibility, but it is starting to spread slowly, and it is great that we're at least saying that people have a legal right to request, could we restructure my job a little bit differently? I'll give you an example. When I was first doing pilot work for the Work Family Health Work study that involved grocery store workers, I went to a number of stores. I always go to the organizations to do some research before we do the measurement and think about the intervention. And there was a worker working in the cash register that had problems with her hand, carpal tunnel disease, and she could not get off an hour early to go to her occupation or to her physical therapist. Those types of accommodation are reasonable accommodation in my view. And we really need to think in the U.S. not at this one-off deal, but the idea that everyone over their life course will want some flexibility, whether it's expanded to education, to military leave, to some of the companies even in the Silicon Valley. I know, I don't know what you think about Facebook, but they give some workers a 6-month sabbatical, I read. You know, those types of innovations might keep people working longer in this country than just, I have to work crazy for 20 or 30 years and then retire and go, you know, sip wine by a boat in Florida. Maybe there's a different way to keep the U.S. economy competitive so people will enjoy working longer.
Thank you. Here is another question, maybe related to this, may not be quite related to this, but other than legislation that mandates organization into prioritizing work flexibility, what other options are there for encouraging better management in this regard? Are there anything else?
Well, I think it starts with the leadership, and I sometimes talk about the idea of work-life leadership, that it's, you know, in the U.S. we think about it managing ourselves, but really increasingly the middle and senior leaders and even the first-line managers set the tone for what workers feel comfortable with. And I think we need to, rather in the U.S., sort of take a hands-off, laissez-faire, you figure out work-life issues, it's your problem. We need to be more employer-forward in what we do. We need to be a little bit more activist. This is just like a part of a diversity and inclusion strategy. My early statistics in the presentation showed the adverse impact of work-life needs, where many of the workers were women and minorities that need it the most, yet are in the lower paid, lower controlled jobs. And so this is a diversity, equity, and inclusion issue. And if leaders are talking about this and caring about DEI, work-life issues need to be included as part of diversity, equity, inclusion strategies, not this separate benefit that is sort of like, you know, we'll let a vendor care for it. It needs to be front and center on our culture of overwork and expectations about what is high performance and what is on, and how we can reward leaders that get the job done without burning out people or having high quit rates and just hiring new workers and having a cycle of people on a carousel in and out of the organization.
That's wonderful. Thank you. I'm seeing a couple of other questions as well. So let me talk about one here, which is about the national paid leave. That's a discussion that we've been having of late. This question comes up which says, post-COVID, there was an assumption that national paid leave would garner significant support, but does not seem like it'll happen now either, right? We are the only nation that does not have such a policy. What do you think needs to happen before such a policy becomes a reality?
So there was bipartisan support, and this is not a political lecture. I've just been following paid leave for a long time, from my personal story as well. The Trump administration was also interested in paid leave. I remember Ivanka Trump had a task force on it as well. And I read in the New York Times, I believe today or yesterday, there's an article about paid leave. I believe it was yesterday, about the U.S. lagging. And it said that it is problematic right now that in terms of it being part of the larger bill, that some of the parties view it as infrastructure and others would say, maybe we want to pass it, we just want it separate so we can argue or work out the details, because that's where the cost comes in. Of those 186 countries, for example, that have maternity leave, how do you fund it? Is it employee contributions? What percent of employee contributions, employer contributions? Is there a minimum tenure? Is it 100% paid leave? Is it 80%? That's where the costs come in. And yet, I think that there is the will, and I'm hopeful that there's still what I've read, even 4 weeks of paid leave would be not enough for people if they had a medically difficult labor, but still better than nothing. But if not, let's break it out. And I think there is political will. And I've seen a survey that says something like 82% of Americans are interested and support some form of paid leave. One thing I wanted to say that I also think is interesting, well, the U.S. is behind in many ways. One of the things that if the legislation does go through that is interesting is the U.S. is broad in how it defines family. That it could be a friend, it could be caring for your in-laws. I believe now the Family Medical Leave Act that is unpaid, if you are a daughter-in-law, you may or may not get time off to care for in-laws or things like that. So I think we could innovate if the idea that we will give people more time off to help people who are a domestic partner and people that are very, very close friends. Many people are living alone now, getting married later in life or not getting married at all. So I'm hopeful for the future.
Thank you. So this question is from David Hummels. What benefits do employers enjoy when they offer less flexibility to workers? How do they compensate for that loss when they become more flexible?
Oh, Dean Hummels, I don't know what to say about that. But I mean, in the short run, yes, they get long hours and people they're working all the time. But is that what we really want for a long-term sustainability of the workforce? I believe that there is a fundamental shift in how people are viewing work and the role of work in their life. And I think those employers that don't offer any flexibility, they may have what would be called lower transaction costs or process losses for managing different schedules. So yes, there is a cost to managing more flexible, less standardized schedules. But I even think we can make the ability to have some flexibility a little bit more standard. So one idea that I've been working on with a scholar in the UK is the idea of having some kind of transparent negotiation of flexibility of different options so it's not so secret. Because right now we all know a number of workers are saying, hey boss, can I have this deal? Can I work at home 2 days a week? And somebody else gets a different deal. Let's make the idea to have what's called an ideal, an idiosyncratic or individualized deal standard. And let's have maybe a menu of options. And maybe that's a way to minimize transaction costs. Airlines have this. For example, people can do shift trades. I know that Delta Airlines, I believe, has a very good system. And we can think about these different ways of being flexible for all different types of occupations. I believe Cummins engines right here in Indiana, during the winter, we know that cars aren't going to start, that schools may be delayed. So people can call in sick without losing their job or say, I need to have flexibility. And they have, I believe, a rotator staffing person in some parts, some of the plants that can work into different parts of the plant to cover. And so employer staffing levels is another way that might improve quality and enable flexibility and would not be that costly.
So related to this question, right, Ellen, when we think about the zero-sum game, right, because the jobs have to get done, some people are going to be needing flexibility because of some issues and things like that. What's the best way to think about, because if you push all the other work to the other employees, that becomes a problem as well, right? If suppose some employee finds that her mother or her father has a chronic condition, dementia or something like that, some of the work maybe have to be transferred over to their other employees. As a leader, right, as a supervisor, how should they be approaching this? Are there best practices that people might find relevant?
I think the framing of the question, respectfully, I think it shows how we think about flexibility as this ad hoc, one-off deal. I think we need to rethink the organization to allow flexibility in the business system, because we know that, for right now, there could be a surge on campus. We might have to shut down. Somebody would have to cover. We know that people have some needs for flexibility, and I would argue most people over the course of their life will need some flexibility. They'll have an operation, they'll just want time to work out every day, and they work better at night. I've read it also that a lot of the Gen Z workers don't really like these standardized hours. They think that that is not the way they want to work. So I think we have to really have a think tank in different industries, because the rhythms of a 24/7 nursing system where you have staffing levels that are mandated to cover different forms of acuity in patient care, that's going to take some thinking. But I do know, for example, self-scheduling has been successfully done in many healthcare organizations, and you first try and let workers pick the schedule they want, and then for those times that you can't easily cover, you put in a system that is fair. Now, whether, if it's seniority based and the people that are lowest on the totem pole never get flexibility, that's not going to work. So I really think, I don't have all the answers, but I think we have to basically have principles of allowing some options for people, backup staffing, deal with issues of equity and fairness, and don't make these exceptions all the time. That's where we're creating the problems and the bad will.
Perfect, thank you. I have a question from Jim Dworkin. Have you studied whether unions have had much success in negotiating these kinds of work balance strategies?
Yes, I was part of a large Alfred P. Sloan funded study on flexibility. We had one paper with a colleague named Peter Berg published in the ILR Review. We have another one about ready to come out, where basically we went into 9 organizations in the U.S. and looked at flexibility where it was part of the labor contract. And many of those jobs were frontline jobs. What we found in that study, and we're looking at how it was distributed over teams, so it took a long time to think about how it was implemented at the workgroup level, that unions, when they were for flexibility, it did help them in labor relations. But I do think unions were better at negotiating flexibility in what we thought of as the benefits form of paid time off, sick and family leave, and were less developed in the flexible work schedule. And there was a gendered impact in that, for example, at a large major metropolitan area, there was a primarily female union that were being the psychologists and the helpers with probation with children, and in the juvenile system they wanted part-time work, and the more male maintenance workers union did not want part-time work. So I think those are some problems to advance. I will give you one example of flexibility in a unionized setting where it was at a pharmaceutical company. It was a print shop, and they had a lot of overtime, and what the organization did is they got the union to agree to a 4-day work week, 4 10-hour days, and the workers agreed to no more overtime, and that saved the company a lot of money. So a compressed work week is one way. Also, I've studied police departments often do 3 or 4 day work weeks as a way to have unionized flexibility in some flexible schedules. So compressed work week, there has been some success with that in particular. I've also studied government workers that are teleworkers, and I think the government is where probably most of the innovation is occurring in flexibility. As during COVID and even before that, the U.S. government did experiment in a big way with flexibility. So maybe the private sector has something in this case to learn from the federal workforce and how they're implementing flexibility and lessons learned.
Thank you. I have 2 more questions. The next one is, do you see flexibility that some companies may now offer lasting overtime, or that is, will companies go back to business as usual when COVID fades?
So variation exists in employment relations. So some organizations will, particularly where there's the narrative or belief that we can only be creative when everybody's all in the room all the time. And I think others will experiment and learn a way to leverage flexibility. Think right now, if you're in a global team, there's no way you can get everybody in the office in Lafayette, Indiana, if somebody's working for you overseas. So I think we have to be more purposeful about when we bring people together, why we bring people together. I do think coming together is important to have relationships with people and for creative innovation, but I don't think we need it all the time. And how many of us have flown across the country for a meeting that's like an hour? Was that really worth it? So I think I'm hopeful that we don't go back 100% the employer-driven form of flexibility, but have some more give and take and really rethink about when we bring people together. And I do think there could be cost savings from that as well for the employer.
Perfect, thanks. This is the last question I have, Ellen. So this is putting you in the spot right there. What is Purdue University doing well, and what is it not? I know you have done an amazing job here doing some of the reports during the COVID time for us, for the Provost's office as well. So you probably have had a chance to look at that. So what does Purdue do well, and what is it not doing well?
Well, I don't want to really talk about Purdue University, but I will talk about this large study. And Purdue, I think, has done many things well. I would rather talk about the nature of academic work in general and the cultures of academic work. So I have a study coming out. I got published in the Journal of Applied Psychology on disrupted work-life boundaries. And it was really how women in STEM managed work and non-work tasks during the pandemic, those that stayed in. And in some colleges, such as, I believe, aerospace engineering, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's like 9 or 10% of senior professors are women. So in those occupations where women are highly underrepresented, it was difficult to have work then come totally in the home, and do I really want my colleagues to see my child playing by me or my messy house and so forth. So I think what universities have done well is recognize that the COVID-19 did have impact on careers and extended the tenure clock. I think what was challenging that we could have done better is I think many of the faculty wanted workload reduction. There was actually an increase in workload when you're trying to, take care of your family, your children, and prep everything online or salvage experiments that were ruined and grants. And I think just extending the tenure clock had adverse impact on women if COVID hadn't improved, if they were still doing more of the work. I also think universities need to be more flexible on standards to account for what is an ideal worker in different ways to have excellence. So maybe think about career paths a little bit more flexibly without hurting quality, but allowing people over the life course, since many are starting families or managing relationships as they're trying to get tenure after slogging it through a PhD, and we have a very short clock. So let's just be more flexible on flexibility.
Thank you very much, Ellen. Thanks wonderfully for answering all these questions.
Well, thank you, Ellen, for that great presentation and also your thoughtful answers to the questions that came in from the audience. The questions were so timely given the experiences that all of us are facing with COVID. I'd also like to thank our audience for joining us for the Luann Aday Distinguished Lecture. The next lecture in the Distinguished Lecture series will take place on Friday, November 12th at 3 p.m. It will be given by Mike Monfra, the Bill and D. O'Brien Distinguished Professor of Physics and Astronomy in the College of Science and Professor of Materials Engineering and Electrical and Computer Engineering in the College of Engineering. He will be giving the 2021 Arden J. L. Bement Junior Distinguished Lecture. I hope you all can join us then. Thanks again for your time this afternoon.